My name is Cleo. I'm 28 years old, and I was somewhere between Ottawa and Kingston on the Via Rail when I stopped a woman's laptop bag from braining a sleeping stranger in the aisle seat below. She thanked me, I helped her settle it back into the overhead rack, and she introduced herself as Harriet. A retired civil servant, she said. Just visiting some old colleagues at the federal offices on Wellington Street before heading home to Toronto. I told her my name and not much else, because my phone had just buzzed with a message from my fiancé that had turned every coherent thought in my head to static. She poured tea from a thermos. The lid was a small ceramic reindeer, very her, and she told me I looked like someone who needed to sit quietly for a moment. She was not wrong. 4 days later, my fiancé saw Harriet standing beside me at his parents' dining room table and laughed out loud, in front of his family and their lawyer and his mother's charity board friends who had come for dessert. 15 minutes after that, his father had gone the color of old concrete and excused himself from the room. And my fiancé finally understood exactly whose help he had been casually dismissing since the moment I introduced her. Before I go any further, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. And if someone has ever underestimated you because of who was standing next to you, hit like. You'll want to stay for how this ends. I had been with my fiancé for 3 years. Joel was 31, the kind of person who filled every room he walked into, and for a long time I found that quality genuinely attractive. He worked at his family's property development company, Vance Properties, a mid-sized firm his father Bernard had built over 20 years, developing residential and mixed-use projects across the GTA. Joel handled acquisitions, which in practice meant he took meetings, shook hands and had his name attached to press releases, while the actual due diligence got done by the people who didn't receive the credit for it. I am a chartered professional accountant. I specialize in forensic accounting. I find money that people have tried very hard to make invisible. I had been doing it for 5 years at a firm in downtown Toronto, and I was good at it. Good enough that 2 of our firm's largest corporate clients had specifically requested me when their files came up for review. My fiancé introduced me at dinner parties as Cleo. She does accounting, delivered with a certain fond lightness, the same way someone might say their partner enjoys pottery. It had stopped registering after a while, or I had told myself it had. The ring had been my grandmother's. A simple platinum band with a single round diamond, not flashy, not the kind of thing that gets photographed for a ring announcement post. But she had worn it every day of her adult life and had pressed it into my palm 2 weeks before she passed, just after my 25th birthday. When my fiancé and I got engaged, I suggested using it rather than buying something new. He agreed. His mother Miriam had never quite forgiven me for that decision. Too understated, she said at our first dinner together, turning my hand over with 2 fingers as though appraising something at a consignment shop. Not what people expect from a Vance engagement. That was Miriam in a single sentence. She had spent 3 decades building a specific picture of what the Vance name looked like in a room, and I had been failing to fit that picture since our first handshake. On the day I boarded the Via Rail from Ottawa, I had been in the capital for a 2-day professional conference, sessions on fraud indicators in the construction sector, which I would later understand was almost cosmically appropriate timing. I was tired and I wanted to get home. Then my fiancé's message arrived. He had written it formally, almost like a legal brief. His mother's lawyers had filed a conduct complaint against me with CPA Ontario. The complaint alleged that I had used my firm's professional access to confidential databases to research Vance Properties without authorization, to gather personal information for use within the context of our personal relationship. Pure fabrication. But a complaint like that, if not properly addressed, could trigger a suspension of my designation pending investigation. It could cost me my position at the firm. In the worst case, pursued aggressively enough, it could end my career entirely. And at the very bottom of the message, appended as though it were a minor logistical note, my fiancé had written, "Mom feels, and I agree it's cleaner, if you return the ring before the mediation session next Thursday. It belongs to our family to decide what to do with going forward." I read that last sentence 4 times. The ring belonged to my grandmother, who had saved for it over 5 years of teaching grade 4 in Hamilton, who had worn it through 41 years of marriage, who had chosen me, specifically and deliberately, to give it to. He had written our family as though my grandmother's entire life history was a footnote to Miriam's preferences. I did not reply. I put the phone face down on the tray table and looked at the November fields running gray outside the window, and I made a decision about how the next 7 days were going to go. That was when Harriet's bag slipped. She had been across the aisle reading a physical book, something dense, small print, and when the train lurched on a curve she had reached up instinctively and missed the strap. I caught the bag before it cleared the rack entirely. It was heavier than expected. She'd packed a full laptop and what turned out to be a leather document portfolio. I got it seated properly, checked it was secure, and looked at her properly for the first time. Late 60s, maybe early 70s. White hair cut short and neat, glasses on a beaded chain. The posture of someone accustomed to being listened to, wearing it lightly. She thanked me twice, poured the tea, looked at me with the directness of a person who has spent a long time reading people quickly and does not waste the skill. She asked about the documents on my tray table. I had been working, legitimately, as part of a contracted review my firm was completing for a commercial real estate entity, trying to clear my head through the familiar discipline of numbers. I said it was nothing complicated. She said gently that the look on my face suggested otherwise. There was something about the train and the tea, and the fact that I was cornered with nowhere to redirect myself, that made me talk. I told her about the complaint in broad terms. I told her about the ring. I did not use names or identify the company. She listened the way almost no one listens, without preparing her response, without rushing to offer a solution before I had finished. When I was done, she asked if she could look at what I was reviewing. Not my personal situation, the documents on the table. I hesitated. She said she had spent a long time working around construction sector financials and might help me think through whatever was giving me trouble. I assumed she meant she'd worked in municipal planning or perhaps a provincial ministry. I passed her the top section of the file. She found the irregularity in under 2 minutes. A pattern in the subcontractor invoicing across 3 consecutive quarters, amounts structured just below reporting thresholds, cycling through 3 separate holding entities. She set the papers down and described the mechanism to me in the precise technical language of someone who had written enforcement guidelines on exactly this kind of structure. I felt the specific chill that comes when 2 unrelated things suddenly align. Because the entity in those documents was not Vance Properties. But the structure was identical to something I had noticed weeks earlier, peripherally in files I had legitimate access to through the firm. Files that connected back to Vance. I didn't say that out loud. I thanked her, took the pages back, and we talked about other things the rest of the way into the city. She mentioned Hamilton, 2 grown children, cross-country skiing in the Gatineau Hills. She asked what I liked about my work, and I told her. I liked the moment when the numbers stopped pretending. She smiled at that, a particular kind of smile, the one that means someone has just confirmed something they already suspected about you. At Union Station she gave me her card. I didn't look at it until I was in the cab. When I read it, I sat very still in the back of that taxi for a long time, watching the streetlights of the city come in around me, and I thought about everything Miriam had ever implied about me, not being serious enough, not being the right kind of person, not being the right kind of woman. And then I thought about what Harriet had found in 90 seconds, that apparently 3 senior partners had walked past without seeing. My fiancé called that evening. He was measured, careful, almost kind, which was somehow worse than if he'd been angry. He said the situation had become complicated and it was better for everyone to take a step back. He said he still cared about me. He used the word practical 3 times in 4 minutes, which told me clearly who had scripted the call. I asked him one question before I ended it. Whose idea was the complaint? He didn't answer. He said the mediation session was Thursday at 11, and that Holloway, his family's lawyer, would send the location details. Then he said goodnight. I opened my laptop. I worked for 11 hours. Not in any restricted or unauthorized way, only through records my firm had contracted access to, public CDR filings, corporate registrations and databases I was fully credentialed to access. By the time morning came through my east-facing window in a gray wash of November light, I had built a picture I had not been looking for and could not unsee. Joel's father, Bernard, had been running a systematic invoicing scheme through Vance Properties for at least 4 years. Subcontractor payments inflated, funds routed through holding companies he controlled, the difference extracted as consulting fees paid to entities registered to a numbered company in his wife's name. The amounts had been deliberately structured to stay below FinTrack reporting thresholds, quiet, almost invisible, the kind of pattern that looks like noise until someone with the right training stops and counts it. And my name appeared on 3 of the documents as a signatory witness. I had never seen those pages in my life. I had certainly never signed them, but there was my signature, or rather, a version of it, attached to records that placed me, on paper, as a knowing participant in transactions I had no awareness of. He had built a paper trail designed to point at me. The conduct complaint was the first move, discredit my professional standing before I could report anything. Make me look like someone who abused access for personal reasons, so that whatever I found or said afterward looked like the work of a vindictive ex-partner rather than an accountant doing her job. It was methodical, it was precise, and it had very nearly worked. I called Harriet at 7 in the morning. She picked up on the second ring. I won't share the full substance of what we discussed because some of it became part of a formal process, but I will tell you this. She did not hesitate. She asked me to send her a secure copy of my documentation. She reviewed it that afternoon and called back at 4. Her voice was even and careful and completely without alarm. She told me my documentation chain was sound. She told me the forged signatures were detectable through standard forensic analysis. She told me the invoicing pattern fell squarely within federal financial reporting legislation. Specifically, she said, an area she knew something about. I asked her what her actual role had been. She said she had spent her last 12 years as Deputy Director of Financial Intelligence at FinTrack. She had retired 8 months ago. She was currently serving as chair of the Professional Conduct Committee at CPA Canada, the national oversight body with authority over provincial CPA complaint proceedings, including the complaint Miriam had filed against me in Ontario. I remember sitting perfectly still after she finished saying that. The kind of stillness that happens when your brain needs a moment to fit new information into the correct shape. Go to the mediation session, she told me. Let them lay out their position first. When they're finished, call me from the lobby. I'll come up. Thursday. The mediator's office on Bay Street, 32nd floor. I arrived 20 minutes early and could already see through the glass partition. Joel and his parents and Holloway settled around the table, talking with the easy posture of people who know how the afternoon is going to go. His mother was laughing at something. His father was checking his phone. My fiancé was leaning back in his chair the way he always did when he was certain an outcome was already decided. I texted Harriet, she replied, "Lobby ready when you are." She was standing near the building directory, portfolio under her arm, exactly as composed as she had been on the train. We rode up together without saying much. She straightened her blazer. She produced a granola bar from her bag without ceremony and handed it to me. Because I had not eaten. Because she had probably noticed that the moment I sat down beside her on the elevator. We walked into the mediation room. My fiancé looked up, then his gaze moved to Harriet, her age, her quiet clothes, the sensible shoes, and I watched the expression move across his face. Recognition of a category. Someone not quite what was expected, not quite the right kind of backup. He looked at his mother. Something passed between them that I had seen at garden parties when a guest arrived slightly underdressed. He said, out loud, pitched just above conversational, "Did you bring someone with you, Cleo?" I didn't realize we were doing that today. His mother touched the stem of her water glass and didn't quite hide her smile. His father didn't bother hiding anything. Holloway opened with precision and calm. He laid out the family's position. The conduct complaint against me cast material doubt on my credibility. Any documents I had gathered that touched on Vance Properties were compromised by the circumstances of their collection and would not survive a challenge. My claim for compensation related to 2 years of unremunerated consulting work was unsubstantiated, and the ring, he settled back slightly as he said it, had been a family piece shared during the relationship and should be returned as a matter of basic decency before this proceeding went any further. The mediator, Ms. Albrecht, careful and professional, was listening in the way mediators listen when one side has clearly come better prepared. Then Harriet set her portfolio on the table. She didn't stand up, she didn't raise her voice. She opened the portfolio, took out 2 pages, and slid them across to Ms. Albrecht. She introduced herself, full name, full title, current role. Said it the way someone gives their postal code, a fact, delivered without performance. I watched Holloway's face. I watched the exact instant he registered who was sitting across from him. It moved through him like cold water. A minute contraction around the jaw, a stillness in the eyes, and then the very specific recalibration of a man who has just realized the room has entirely different dimensions than he thought. Bernard reached for his glass and put it back down without drinking. He had gone the color of old concrete. My fiancé looked from Holloway to his father and said quietly, "What's happening?" Nobody answered him. Harriet spoke for approximately 12 minutes. She addressed the FinTrack mandate and the specific structures she had identified in my documentation, reviewed in her capacity as a private financial expert. She noted that the documentation had been gathered entirely within my professional authorizations, and that the conduct complaint appeared, on its face, to have been filed in bad faith as a mechanism to suppress evidence of financial misconduct. A circumstance that the CPA Canada Professional Conduct Committee, of which she was current chair, would find directly relevant when the complaint came before them. She addressed the forged signatures and the invoice cycling pattern, and the offshore holding structures, with the flat specificity of someone who had spent a decade writing enforcement standards on exactly these mechanisms. She closed the portfolio. She looked at Ms. Albrecht and said she would appreciate remaining in the room for the remainder of the session. Ms. Albrecht said, "Of course." Holloway asked for a 5-minute break. He came back looking like a man who had made a phone call he did not enjoy. He sat down and did not look at Bernard. He said to the table generally that his client wished to revisit the structure of the discussion. My fiancé had been quiet for most of this. Now he looked at me directly for the first time since the session began, really looked without the studied blankness he'd been wearing all week. I recognized the expression from early in our relationship, before any of this. The look of someone who has just caught up to something they had been trying not to know. He said my name, just that. I said, "The ring was my grandmother's. Your mother knew that when she had Holloway ask for it back, and she did it anyway." He didn't argue. There was nothing left to argue with. The session ran another 40 minutes. At the end of it, Ms. Albrecht had facilitated a formal agreement. The ring returned to me immediately, my 2 years of consulting contribution recognized as a compensable asset, the professional complaint dismissed with the mediator's endorsement of bad faith filing, and the financial documentation formally noted for referral to the appropriate federal authority. The word referral was the part that made Bernard stand up and say he needed some air. He did not come back. Miriam sat without speaking for the last 20 minutes. When Holloway began packing his papers, she turned toward me. I braced for something cutting. Instead, she looked like someone who was simply, finally, tired. She didn't say anything at all. My fiancé met me in the elevator lobby outside the hearing room. He had the ring in his jacket pocket, which meant Miriam had expected a different outcome. He held it out in his palm. I took it. I didn't say thank you because I wasn't grateful. I was taking back what had never stopped belonging to me. We stood there the way people stand when language has run out of things it can usefully do. He asked after a moment if I had known about his father. I told him honestly. I had noticed something was off for months. I hadn't gone looking for it. But when you work in forensic accounting long enough, certain patterns become impossible to look past. He said, "You could have told me." I said, "I know." He went back toward the conference room. I pressed the elevator button for the lobby. Harriet was waiting near the building's front doors. She looked up from her phone when I came through, took one look at my face and said simply, "Good." We went to a Tim Hortons on Front Street, which felt exactly right. Large coffees, window seats, the particular November light that makes Toronto look like a city bracing for something. I told her what had happened in the last 20 minutes of the session. She's listened, nodded at the parts that mattered. When I finished, she said, "The complaint against your designation will be formally closed within 10 business days. I'll see to it." She waved off my thanks in the same way she'd waved it off on the train. Not with false modesty, just with the practicality of someone who has done a useful thing and doesn't need it acknowledged beyond the fact of it. Then she told me that she had forwarded my name. With my permission, she was very deliberate about specifying that, to the director of a federal financial intelligence unit in Ottawa that was building a new internal fraud analysis team. The posting hadn't gone public yet. They needed a senior analyst with private sector forensic experience. She had sent them 3 pages of my documented work from the past 48 hours, with identifying details removed, and they had come back to her that afternoon. I held the card she gave me. On the back was a handwritten name and a direct line. She said, "Call Monday, he's expecting you." I put my grandmother's ring back on my finger that evening. It sat where it had always belonged. On my hand, in my life, no longer subject to what someone else's family thought it was worth or meant to signify. The platinum was warm from my palm within a minute. I called Ottawa on Monday morning. The conversation ran just over an hour. By Tuesday, I had a formal offer in writing. By January, I had a 1-bedroom apartment in the Glebe, 3 blocks from the Rideau Canal, which freezes every winter and fills with skaters every February in a way that feels like the city is briefly, unambiguously glad to be as itself. I work on Slater Street now. My office has a window. The case involving Bernard Vance is an active federal matter, and I am not at liberty to discuss specifics, but I will tell you that forensic accountants sleep well when their documentation is organized correctly and their chain of evidence is clean. Bernard's lawyers have been very busy this winter. I think about Harriet sometimes. How she sat across an aisle and said almost nothing about herself until it became necessary to say exactly the right things. Some people carry their authority so quietly that you don't notice its weight until they set it down in precisely the room where it matters most. She caught a bag on a train and I helped her with it, and that was all either of us did at first. The rest was just a matter of reading the numbers correctly and waiting for the right moment to show them to the right people. My grandmother would have liked her. I think they were made from a similar patience, the kind that looks like stillness from a distance but is, underneath, entirely certain of itself. If you've ever had someone try to take something from you by making you question whether you had the right to hold it, I want you to tell your story in the comments, and subscribe, because I'll be back with more. I always read every single one of you.